In 1444, 6 Portuguese caravels returned home, carrying a cargo of some 240 African captives bound for slavery. Slavery, obviously, was not unheard of in Europe, and indeed in the previous centuries, many Europeans had contracted with Islamic slave traders to purchase a variety of forced laborers, including some Africans. But this voyage was different. It marked the first time that Europeans had set sail themselves for the express purpose of acquiring slaves from Africa to labor for them. It marked the beginning, but obviously, if you know anything about this topic, it was far from the end. Now, perhaps you might say to yourself, all right, I get it. Slavery is a bummer. Like, it's not a good thing. And for the people who were captured as slaves, like, that really sucked. Their lives were nightmares. But, on the other hand, slavery was far from unusual as a historical phenomenon. This was not the only time that people had been taken captive and forced to work for the benefit of others. Most regions on the planet have had, at some point in their past, some form of coerced or non-free labor. Moreover, perhaps one could argue that the sort of slavery established by this Atlantic slave trade was kind of old-fashioned and antiquated from its very beginning, and was soon rendered obsolete by the rise of modern capitalist economies. After all, wasn't it abolished? Like, aren't we making way too big a deal out of all of this? Or to put it another way, was the Atlantic slave trade BS? That's what we're here to discuss. Hi, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell. This one is relatively easy to answer. The African slave trade was enormously important and represented one of the foundations of modern capitalist economies. It was not separate from the process of the development of those economies. It was an integral part, a necessary foundation, if you will, of those economies. And from the get-go, let's begin with something of a disclaimer here. A lot of this discussion is going to represent the Atlantic slave trade as being enmeshed in a kind of economic system, a global network, if you will. So our focus is not really going to be on the lived experience of the people who actually labored as slaves. And I don't want to be misunderstood here. Everything that you have heard about the process of enslavement of Africans, the nightmarish quality that their lives possessed, from the terror of them being taken captive and stolen away from their families and their communities, the horrors of the Middle Passage when they're crammed on board slave ships and transported across the Atlantic, the utter brutality of conditions under which they labored as slaves, the inadequate food and shelter, the backbreaking labor, the violence inflicted upon them, torture, rape, in some cases even murder. All of that was absolutely real, and we should not lose sight of the fact that this was an institution that depended upon brutality inflicted upon real human beings at its very core. That said, we're trying to explain how and why this Atlantic slave trade flourished. And while if you know anything about human history, we don't need a whole lot of encouragement as a species to be awful to one another.
Lady, people aren't chocolates. Do you know what they are mostly? Bastards. Bastard-coated bastards with bastard filling.
Still, awfulness on this scale requires some incentives. And that's what we're kind of focusing on, is the economic logic of the Atlantic slave trade. Well, sometimes you hear the colonial economies of which the African slave trade was a part referred to as mercantilist. You could also certainly refer to this as the earliest forms of capitalism, if that seems tendentious. Why don't we just say that this is the dawning of a system of global economies that are recognizable as modern? And slavery was not a sideshow to the development of those economies, but rather was a central, foundational part of the rise of those economies. How so? So glad you asked. First and foremost, what we're talking about is the rise of a global economic network that linked together numerous different parts of the world. Ground zero for this was the European encounter with North and South America, beginning with Columbus in 1492, which I've actually already done a video on Columbus. If you haven't seen that, well, maybe you might want to. But that encounter initiated a process of European conquest of large parts of the Americas and the establishment of colonies. The first thing to understand about those colonies is that by and large, they were geared towards the production of commodities that could be sold at a tremendous profit to enhance the wealth of the people who controlled that production. And despite what you may have heard about, pilgrim forefathers sailing across the ocean to establish a new life for themselves and religious liberty and all that jazz, for the most part, Europeans who went to the Americas did not do so to settle down and become subsistence farmers and raise families or anything like that. They went across the ocean to get rich, to produce some stuff that they could sell, and return to Europe and live like kings. Now, the commodities that we are talking about, the earliest stuff, just precious metals, mining gold and silver. The Spanish especially are big into that in the 1500s. But gradually there is a transition to the production of certain agricultural commodities. We are talking about coffee, tobacco. So some of this is obviously addictive drugs. Also indigo to use as a commercial dye. One of the biggest commodities, especially in the 1600s and 1700s in the Caribbean and Brazil, is sugar. Big time profit cultivating sugarcane to refine. But the champion commodity of them all in this colonial agricultural system was cotton. As the Industrial Revolution got going, starting first in England and then spreading to the rest of Europe, and eventually to New England and the United States, there was an increasing enormous demand for cotton textiles. Cotton could only be produced in certain parts of the world. As it turns out, it grew very well in the Americas. To give you some sense of how tremendously important cotton was to just the economies of Britain and the United States, we might note that in 1830, a full 1 out of every 6 workers in Britain itself was involved in the production of cotton textiles in some way, shape, or form. More than 1/10 of all English capital was invested in cotton textiles production. It was an enormous linchpin of the British economy. And obviously they got to get that cotton from somewhere. A lot of it came from the southern United States. Between 1815 and 1860, cotton comprised more than half of all of the United States' exports. In a lot of ways, cotton drove the Industrial Revolution, was on the leading edge of the development of the modern economy. So this European presence in the Americas was geared towards the production of commodities. And these are things you need if you're going to produce commodities. You need people to invest capital. You need the state to guarantee contracts and to protect the property. You need land itself. But obviously, you've already stolen that, expropriated it from the native populations using your military. But the one other thing that you definitely need if you're going to produce these sorts of commodities is labor. You need somebody to do the work of cultivating these crops. You need somebody to pick that cotton. You need somebody to mine that gold. You need somebody to raise that sugar cane and cut it and process it. So where was that labor going to come from? You might say, well, why don't they? I mean, these are European endeavors. Why don't they use European workers? That happened to a certain extent. I mean, indentured labor in the New World was a thing. But at the same time, there wasn't necessarily an enormous surplus of European workers that could simply be brought easily across the ocean. A lot of those guys were being used and indeed exploited for various purposes back home in Europe. You could also potentially use the labor of Native Americans. And that did happen during the earliest stages of this process. But the methods used by European conquerors, the brutality of the conquest, the horrific conditions under which they forced the natives to labor, the forced starvation policies, the diseases they brought with them, all of that led to catastrophic mortality among native populations. One of the first places that Columbus landed, the island of Hispaniola, within the space of 50 years, had been almost totally depopulated. The native populations exterminated entirely. It was like that through a lot of the Caribbean. Survival rates were slightly better on the mainland, but still, by some estimates, as much as 90% of the overall native population died within several centuries of first contact here. So that population isn't really around to be used as a continuing slave population. So what that leaves then is African labor that Europeans could plug into a pre-existing African slave trading network and procure captives to transport across the ocean to labor on the plantations to produce these commodities. Labor problem solved. And by saying, well, they can plug into a pre-existing network, does that mean that Africans were themselves complicit in the creation of the African slave trade? Yeah, if we're being honest. Again, like, human beings do not need a whole lot of encouragement to be awful to one another. And human awfulness is not necessarily tied to any particular one culture or ethnicity or race or what have you.
Well, I guess they had it coming.
We all have it coming, Captain.
So certainly that does mean that some of the great states of Western Africa, the kingdoms of the Asante, or the Oyo, or Dahomey, the trade networks of the Ekpe and Aro, those guys were more than willing to do deals with the Europeans for various other commodities. I mean, this does, again, link to a global network. Before the British were big into producing their own cotton textiles, they were involved as middlemen trading textiles produced in India to Africa to acquire slaves. Likewise, firearms were also used to exchange for African slaves. But obviously, this does not excuse the European role in the Atlantic slave trade. And certainly it is true, whatever existing African slave trading there was before the rise of the Atlantic slave trade was an order of magnitude smaller, and often those more local institutions of African slavery without, minimizing the extent to which it sucks to be a forced laborer, no matter what the conditions. It was not as bad as the sort of slavery that you saw in the New World. And the scope of this slave trade was impressive. Hard to get good, solid numbers on this, since slave traders did not keep such great records, but the estimates range over the course of several hundred years, somewhere between 10 and 15 million Africans who were taken captive, enslaved, transported across the Atlantic to labor in this new economic system. If we want to break it down by time, between 1450 and 1600, probably about 300,000 Africans were enslaved and transported. Between 1600 and 1700, about 1.5 million. And between 1700 and 1810, where you started to see the abolition of the slave trade, we're talking about 5.7 million Africans enslaved and transported to the Americas. So you can see that this is This is an institution that's not actually declining during this period, but it is actually increasing as time goes on. And European slave traders are making enormous profits. By about 1800, sort of the high watermark of the slave trade, it's estimated that 1 out of every 4 ships sailing out of Liverpool in Britain were slave ships. A great many of British corporations in the 21st century that are very sort of well-established, wealthy, prestigious corporations. So Barclays Bank or Lloyd's of London Insurance Corporation, those were originally founded by people who in large part made their fortunes by being involved in the slave trade. Like, this was a big, big deal in terms of numbers and in terms of profit. Now, we did mention that eventually the slave trade was abolished. So you could argue, well, eventually the economy moves beyond this. But, in some ways that's something of an illusion. Certainly, we should note that Enlightenment ideas coming out of the 1700s, arguing that all human beings were entitled to certain natural rights, played a role in this, but also there are some economic motivations. The largest and most successful slave rebellion in all of human history, the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, where you saw the slave inhabitants of the French colony of Saint-Domingue rise up and overthrow the government and establish their own republic. That revealed the instability of slave labor as a system, that there were certain tensions here that it was not possible to entirely paper over. So it was a risky institution. And the prospect of slave rebellions, certainly, I think you could argue, acted as much of an incentive as Enlightenment ideas to gradually abolish the slave trade. As the Brits, who were always sort of the leading slave traders, everybody was involved: the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the United States. But gradually you see a movement towards first the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in 1807, and ultimately slavery itself in 1833. But not everywhere. Obviously slavery in the United States persisted clear up until 1865. And make no mistake, throughout this era, nobody thought that cotton could be produced by free labor. And nowhere was it produced by free labor on the scale that was required for the British Industrial Revolution. So eventually slavery was indeed phased out, but, in some ways it had already done what it needed to do to get the European economies off the ground and allow them to generate enormous amounts of wealth, using land appropriated from Native American populations and labor stolen from Africa. According to some estimates, in Western and Southwestern Africa, anywhere from 1 to 3% of the overall population during the 18th century was taken captive and enslaved during this process. So that's going to have profound consequences for the subsequent development of Africa. In the Americas, obviously, there are going to be several consequences. First of all, it is difficult to talk about the history of slavery without talking about the history of racism. And sometimes you get people who talk about this in terms of, well, racism existed before the African slave trade and was used to justify it, when in fact it seems to be the other way around. That once Europeans were enslaving Africans, they needed to come up with some sort of ideological justification for why this was okay. And so racist ideology is an explicitly modern construct that you start to see for the first time after the rise of the slave trade, arguing that these Africans are in some way supposedly inferior, uncivilized, subhuman, arguing that it was appropriate and indeed necessary for Europeans to take them in hand and to use their labor for civilizing projects. Also, too, obviously, it's not possible to talk about American culture without recognizing that the blending of European and Native American and African traditions that is characteristic of all of the colonial societies of North and South America and the Caribbean are attributable in large part to this process. It is not an equal relationship by any stretch of the imagination, but it has profound consequences for the origins of the modern world. Readings to recommend. The interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano from 1789 gives you a gripping first-hand account of a person who was born in Africa, who was captured and sold into slavery, who labored at various places in the New World before earning his freedom, and became part of the abolitionist movement against slavery. For a nice sort of brief, zingy overview, Edward Reynolds' Stand the Storm, A History of the Atlantic Slave Trade from 1985, is your best bet. And for the central role played by the Atlantic slave trade in the rise of modern capitalist economies, Eric Williams's Slavery and Capitalism, as well as Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton, A Global History, do a great job of describing the centrality of slave labor and this massive economic network in the rise of modern capitalist economies. So, the Atlantic slave trade, absolutely not overblown, both in terms of its dimensions as a tremendous human tragedy, as well as its importance as one of the central pillars in the construction of the modern capitalist economies that have been so characteristic of the past 200 years. Definitely not BS. Grim stuff, but important stuff nonetheless. Hope that helps. Always make sure to check your sources and evidence. See you later.